Quantum HFE Olympic Weightlifting Coach Course, Module Introduction to Weightlifting. So the aim of this module is to present an introduction to weightlifting, including the background of the sport and competitions, and also to present and discuss benefits of weightlifting as a tool for non-weightlifters. So weightlifting has become incredibly popular in the fitness industry over the last 5 to 10 years, as proponents such as CrossFit have championed its benefits. Its use in strength and conditioning circles has long been a standard and commonly a considerable part of the programs of many athletes across the world from numerous different sports. Now, weightlifting platforms are starting to become more common in our everyday health clubs and gyms rather than just strength and conditioning facilities, and it is important that trainers know how to correctly teach, coach, and supervise this specialist type of training. So Olympic weightlifting, or rather we should just refer to it as weightlifting strictly, so when it's performed outside of the Olympic Games it is just weightlifting. Now weightlifting commonly is confused with weight training. Weight training is anything that kind of involves any type of resistance work, so that may be squats and deadlifts, etc., or fixed path machines. Weightlifting, when we refer to that, we're referring to the kind of key weightlifting lifts, in particular the clean, the jerk and the snatch. And this has long been a key facet of athletic training and exercise since Greeks and Romans developed their basic methodologies for improving a soldier's performance or for health of non-combatants. In essence, weightlifting is testing the strength, power of an individual to see the maximum load that they can lift above their head. Sometimes this is performed at slow speeds, such as what we see with more kind of vintage strongman and exercises like the two hands anyhow or the bent press. Sometimes it's performed with unusual objects such as rocks in ancient or more modern strongman competitions. When we refer to weightlifting within this course, we're referring to the two barbell versions, the barbell two hands clean and the jerk, and the two hands barbell. So weightlifting is more focused on the high speed or power exercises that will move a barbell to above the head. Now, weightlifting is a sport, and the first World Championships were held in 1891, and as well as being an event of the first Olympiad in 1896. Like any sport that has a long history, it has changed and evolved over time, and the modern weightlifting events are quite different from those of the early 1900s. Now the two events are the snatch, or strictly speaking the barbell two-hand snatch, which is a lift above the head in one movement. And then the second is the clean and jerk, or again the two hands barbell clean and jerk, where we lift the weight above the head in two movements. We clean it to the chest or shoulders and then we jerk it above the head. But this has not always been the case. For example, in the 1920 Olympic Games there were actually 3 events. We had the one hand barbell snatch, the one hand barbell clean and jerk, and then the two hands barbell clean and jerk. By the 1924 Olympic Games, this had actually increased to 5 lifts with the addition of the two hands press and the two hands. Now the one-handed exercises were removed in 1928 and the sport remained the same with just those 3 lifts until 1972. So we had the two-hand snatch, the two-hand clean and jerk and the two-hand press. I think it changed again in 1972 where the two hands press was actually removed as competitors started to cheat by leaning backwards and using their legs in order to assist in the movement. So they really were kind of hyperextending at the back, and it was deemed that there were going to be some safety issues associated with that. So this left the modern day competitions, which is what we find today, with just the 2 remaining lifts. We've got the snatch and we've got the clean and jerk. Women did not get included into the Olympic program with weightlifting until Sydney in 2000, although they had been competing in World Championships since 1987. So the two-hand snatch and clean and jerk, these are very stable exercises in comparison with the one-hand variations, and as such allow for much greater loads to be lifted. However, the single-hand drills were great complements to these more stable two-hand lifts because of some of the following benefits. Because we were just holding and stabilising the bar with one on one side, there was going to be much greater lateral core and hip stability required. And because, particularly as we were lifting it, it required much greater grip, and also as we caught it, much greater wrist stability as well. There's also much greater shoulder stability required, again because you're trying to stabilize a large single object in one hand. They're also going to be more unstable to lift and catch. So there are some really good benefits. Yeah, you don't lift as much weight, but there are other benefits to be gained from including some of the one-hand old school. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side then, even in 1924, loads of around 87.5 kilos were being snatched by one hand by our elite weightlifters. So more and more modern trainers and non-weightlifters are starting to include and use some of these vintage lifts, these weightlifting drills, in order to achieve kind of greater variety within their weightlifting and weight training program. Now, these types of lifts are covered in our advanced weightlifting workshop, but we won't be going through them within this course. So weightlifting should be viewed as kind of two separate entities. We have weightlifting as a sport, as we've just been describing previously, and which we'll discuss a little bit more in some of the following slides, and also weightlifting for the improvement of health or performance in other sports. So if you're participating in weightlifting as a sport, then it is going to be critical to focus on the performance of those two lifts, since nothing else in competition is going to matter. It doesn't matter if you can squat more than the next guy. If he can snatch or clean and jerk more than you, then that's the guy that's going to win those competitions. Whereas if you use these lifts as a tool in order to improve your sports performance, maybe alongside other tools, or just as part of your exercise program, then variety will be much more beneficial. And you may well use some of the variations and some of the different styles that some of our other weightlifters may not really include within their program. So don't train like a weightlifter if you're not a weightlifter. Yes, we can use these weightlifting lifts as a tool, but you don't really need to kind of focus on them to the exclusion of some of the others, because weightlifters are really trying to perfect those two lifts to the best of their ability. So just have a quick chat about some competitions. So 3 categories are competed in most competitions. We've got the individual lifts, so within a particular weight class, who scores the best snatch and who scores the best clean and jerk, and then we also have the best combined total for the 2 lifts. Each competitor only has 3 lifts to record their highest score and cannot drop down, much like a high jump or in pole vaulting. Can't drop down a weight if they fail to lift at a certain level. So you can choose what 3 weights you want to go for, but if you, let's say you go for 200 kilos, you fail the first time, fail the second time, you can't suddenly drop down to 190. You can either go again or even try and go up if you want to, and try and lift a heavier weight. So if they fail to record a successful weight or successful lift within the first part of the competitions, which is always the snatch, then they're not permitted to continue on to the second phase of competition, the clean and jerk, and obviously do not get included in the combined lift score. Because of these rules, there can be a lot of tactical play within competitions involving deciding when to step in and when to start your 3 lifts, when to skip a weight and move on to a higher weight, and even trying to record personal bests in the clean and jerk in order to win the combined total medal. Since you already know what someone has lifted with the snatch, you can obviously kind of estimate what you need to lift in order to win that event. So we're going to have a quick chat about some of the benefits of Olympic weightlifting, and in particular this may be particularly applicable for athletes from a non-weightlifting background. So they're looking at using weightlifting as a tool in order to improve some of the facets of their sport. So some of the benefits will include increased absolute and relative strength. So absolute strength being increases in strength irrespective of body weight. Relative strength means that you're getting stronger whilst retaining your same kind of body weight. So it takes that into account. And that in particular is going to be quite important. A lot of the changes that we get with weightlifting are not based on increases in muscular size, but they're more neurological changes rather than what we call morphological changes. And so it's really kind of utilizing the neurological system in order to groove these movement patterns, and that's the way that you kind of get stronger on this way. Relative strength in particular is going to be important maybe for females that aren't looking at getting bigger, which is a common issue with that gender, but may want to get stronger, or for athletes that perform in certain weight classes or where weight is an issue in relation to their sport, where they're looking at trying to generate more force but don't want to get increases in size. So if you compete at a particular weight class, for example, and you can get stronger for your weight category, that's brilliant. If you get bigger as well, then chances are you might move up a category. Increased explosive and reactive strength. Again, it's a high speed, strength-based kind of activity, weightlifting, and so we can get used to both lifting and moving heavy loads, more kind of explosive side, but also on the reactive side. Now, most people associate reactive strength training, which is the ability to move from an eccentric to a concentric contraction as quickly as possible, more so with plyometrics, but we do get a similar, slightly less, but a similar effect with weightlifting as well. Other benefits, well, improved vertical jump height, improved speed, and on the speed side we're mostly looking at acceleration because lifting heavier weights really helps us to get used to overcoming inertia. We find the same kind of attributes here. So in particular it's acceleration, so 0 to 5 meters, 0 to 30 meters, that's where we in particular see improvements through weightlifting. Once you start getting into kind of your 100-meter sprinting, well, that becomes linked in with not only being able to accelerate, but also to be able to maintain that kind of maximum speed, so a certain amount of speed endurance. And weightlifting really isn't going to have as much application on that side of things. So we're really looking at the kind of shorter distances on speed and, like I say, mostly acceleration, going from a standing start and getting up to a quickest velocity as quickly as possible. Can be used to help improve body composition, although just exercise is not the only thing associated with body composition. So if you do weightlifting and you have an absolutely shocking diet, it may not make any difference. There is actually, one of the other benefits, quite a low risk of injuries associated with weightlifting, and we'll discuss that in a moment. We can also use weightlifting as a variety or as a progression to our standard slow speed weight training. So you may include currently pressing, deadlifts, squats, etc. And you or your client want to look to kind of progress that, and weightlifting as a combination movement pattern exercise is very good, and also as we start to kind of do it at a quicker velocity, it's a really good way of progressing somebody and challenging somebody's ability. Can be used to help improve shoulder, core, hip, knee and ankle stability, as it does stress all of those kind of particular joints. As long as we apply the loads correctly and the volume correctly, then that should work very well. And one of the other benefits for a lot of people is it does work a high volume of muscle groups all at once. So we are performing pulling, lifting, squatting and pressing movements all kind of within a single exercise, and as such a large amount of muscle mass is going to get utilized in order to lift that weight above the head. So just touching upon the safety aspect, so there is quite actually a low risk of injuries associated with weightlifting. So although the research shows that weightlifting as a sport actually has a much lower incidences of injuries than certain sports like football, volleyball, rugby, etc., there is still the potential for injury as the individual is still lifting a heavy load overhead. So it's not like, okay, I can do weightlifting, I'm not going to get an injury. Whenever you're lifting loads, particularly dynamically, as we said here, there is always the kind of risk. But most people look at weightlifting, particularly in competitions, and see people doing deep overhead squats, deep front squats, and believe that those must naturally correlate with high risks of things like knee injuries and things like that. And actually the research shows that's not the case. If properly taught and correct application of load and progression, then we're not going to see so much of an issue. So this is where good coaching and supervision in particular, following the safety considerations, learning how to safely drop the bar, and following a good coaching model and not rushing through the progressions, as well as following a good kind of training model, so not applying too much load or too much volume, will all help to minimize the risk of injury. We're going to go through the kind of learning progressions and the best way of kind of learning the lifts in one of the following modules, but we're just going to make a quick note on practicing. So it is commonly accepted it takes between about 300 to 500 repetitions for a technique to become more automated or more autonomous, which means you don't have to think about it quite so much. It becomes a little bit more automatic and less in the kind of conscious part of your brain. Best way of doing this, just like most sports, is if you can kind of break the lifts down into segments and learn each segment and really kind of groove the kind of neural programming for each of these movements, then when we start applying all these movements together, it becomes much more fluid and much more easier. So if we were looking at the snatch as one of the lifts, we would break it down to go through things like the snatch balance to learn the catch and recovery. We'd go through power shrugs from a high hang, adapted high pulls from a high hang, first pull deadlifts, adapted Romanian deadlifts, and spending time and almost kind of thinking I need to be doing about 300 to 500 reps minimum for each of these individual sections, and then I can start looking at putting them together. So once you've mastered each of those, then you start to conjugate those segments together. So you might do a power shrug from the low blocks as an example, and you start to link these phases one next to each other. And you will find that it's much easier to learn the lifts if you've practiced all these individual segments to a reasonable number of repetitions. Once you've got all the segments, then it's all about, and you've stuck them together, then it's all about just mastering the correct sequencing. And this is the same if we were learning a golf swing or anything else like that. Break it down, master each individual segment, stick them together, make sure the sequencing is good, and then you're pretty much good to go. So once you've done that, eventually then you'll have a nice fluid snatch movement. Much easier to teach or to learn rather than just trying to do the whole movement all together. So just a little bit of advice on teaching. Once you are happy with each of the exercises yourself, and you've practiced them and you can demonstrate them, then it's important that you consider how best to teach or coach these lifts to others. So the exercise progressions will give you details on key coaching points and cues that you can use when teaching. But one of the main things, always try to keep it simple, so as not to overload the learner with too much information. Really, if you can kind of just give a few teaching points and get your client to practice that, that's the best way of doing it. Also take into account the individual's learning style. Are they more of a visual, auditory or kinesthetic learner? What are their goals, their level of motivation? What are their individual structural limitations? Do they have issues around their hips or shoulder, etc.? What's their motor skill level? And also, what is their core, hip or shoulder strength or stability like, which are commonly key limiting factors during training for each of these particular movements. If you can really take into account all of those informations, all of that info, know how best to teach it to the individual, what their individual requirements are. You also understand how best to break the lifts down, how to spot the errors, how to get that information across to an individual, then you're going to be pretty good at coaching it. So you want to complete the review questions for this section to ensure you've met the learning outcomes, and then move on to the next module.